Comedy Fest Live. And the search begins for the winner of this year's BBC Radio New Comedy Award. Just go online for details. To find out more about the extensive coverage and for clips, search for BBC Edinburgh Festivals.
I'm Jo Brand and I'm serving up an extra slice of Bake Off action with a panel of celebrity fans. I'll shine a spotlight on all the goings-on in the tent, the good, the bad and the soggy bottoms. And every week I'll be joined by the latest baker to leave the tent. The Great British Bake Off, an extra slice. Friday at 9 on BBC Two.
Go away, baby, you don't want me to speak to you like that. You don't want me to
Most schools exclude disruptive pupils.
I ain't putting up with this anymore.
I'm not distracting no one.
But one school takes them in and promises 5 GCSEs. Panorama, Last Chance Academy, tomorrow at 9 on BBC One.
Now on BBC Two, time for Newsnight with Laura Koonsberg.
Not willing to listen, not willing to act. How the authorities let down more than 1,000 children, appallingly abused.
There's some things that I don't remember, but, you know, there's also things that I'll never forget for the rest of my life. And no matter what's done now, and you think if it's investigated now, it's not going to change that. It was too late. It should have been stopped and prevented.
Is Europe still capable of fighting this off? One of NATO's former top brass thinks not.
If NATO is serious about this, it is going to have to rearm. It is going to have to rebuild capability. European nations are going to have to put their money in their pocket, put their hands in their pockets to spend more money on defence.
And the good people of Thanet South in Kent will have the chance to choose him as an MP. Why is Nigel Farage so sure he'll get elected? And we couldn't all squeeze in at the back, but we will hear what Kate Bush was like on stage more than 30 years on. Good evening. For years, children in the Yorkshire town of Rotherham were being raped, beaten and abused and brutally warned off when they threatened to tell. But an independent inquiry today shows they were victims not once, but twice over, because the authorities whose job it was to protect them knew and didn't act to end it. The report's author tells us tonight we need a national system to track this kind of systematic, often violent abuse. Grooming seems far too polite a word. We'll hear from her in a moment. First, here's Chris Cook.
Today, new light has been shed on one of the darkest of stories. Alexis Jay, a social work expert, has conducted a review into Rotherham's child protection, triggered by a series of reports about sexual exploitation. In 2010, 5 local men were prosecuted for abuse in a case that propelled the town's problems onto the front pages. But the results of the review, which look back as far as the late 1990s, suggest that that was just one link in a chilling pattern.
It is hard to describe the appalling nature of the abuse the child victims suffered. They were raped by multiple perpetrators. They were trafficked to other towns and cities in the north of England. They were abducted, beaten and intimidated. There were examples of children being doused with petrol and threatened with being set alight. They were threatened with guns, made to witness brutally violent rapes and threatened they would be the next if they told anyone.
The review looked at 66 case files from vulnerable local children, finding sexual exploitation in 64 cases. The true scale of the problem is hard to gauge, but the report estimated that 1,400 children may have been exploited over 16 years from 1997 to 2013. Whatever the extent of the abuse, the incidents detailed by the report are harrowing. This local woman spoke to BBC Panorama on the condition of anonymity.
I think because the police were aware, social services were aware, and they knew that, and they still didn't stop him, I think it encouraged him, and it almost became like a game to him, you know. He was untouchable.
Or take Child A, a case from the report, who was identified by the authorities of being at risk when she was 12 years old. She was possibly taking drugs and revealed that she had had intercourse with 5 adults. 2 adults received police cautions after admitting as much to them. When her case was discussed by local officials, a local police officer argued that she shouldn't be considered a victim of sexual abuse because he thought that child A had been 100% consensual in every incident. This was overruled by other local officials who had a clear understanding that what had happened was a crime. As that case highlights, there were institutional failures that enabled this tragedy. South Yorkshire Police, the report said, regarded many child victims with contempt. The council ignored warnings and did not take child protection seriously, and there was a particular issue around race. The report notes that by far the majority of the perpetrators were described as Asian by their victims, but several local staff described their nervousness about identifying the ethnic origins of perpetrators for fear of being thought racist. Others remembered clear direction from their managers not to do so. As the report notes, these predatory men preyed on Asian and white girls alike. The council leader has resigned and the police have apologised.
I think importantly we recognise we failed, we've let our young people down, and certainly from the start I want to offer a sincere, unreserved apology for the victims and families that we should have done more with. Importantly, we have commissioned a number of investigations in relation to some of those historical complaints. Them investigations will continue to identify those responsible and bring them to justice.
The extent of the problems in Rotherham are not common, but some of the local institutional problems revealed by the report are. Rotherham ought to be a wake-up call to officials everywhere.
Well, Professor Jay, who wrote today's report, said the authorities involved have a great deal to answer for. Despite that, both Rotherham Council and South Yorkshire Police declined our invitation for an interview. Both had failed to act on repeated warnings in 2002, 2003 and 2006. When I spoke to Professor Jay earlier, I asked her how that could have happened.
It's difficult to understand exactly how it could have happened because the 3 reports to which you refer are so clear in what they are saying about the problem in Rotherham. They couldn't be less ambiguous.
Was there a cover-up then? What was going on in your view, having studied it so carefully?
There were a succession of senior managers and others in the council and in the police who seemed to hold a very similar view, and there seemed to be no form of challenge to that view.
But they even accused some of the younger workers of exaggerating what they'd been finding.
That word was used so frequently by some of the staff who were involved at the time, the front-line staff, but actually also by others in different positions in relation to child sexual exploitation, where it was firmly the belief that there was exaggeration going on about the scale of the problem.
Surely it should be the case that those people who did not take those concerns seriously, as you have described, surely they should not be working in this sector today.
Well, I can only quote the Chief Executive, who has apparently contacted current employers of people who were previously employed by the Council to draw their attention to the report and for any action which they think needs to be taken.
Now, you did not find evidence in your report that sensitivities over ethnicities had affected decision-making, but it's woven through the words and the concerns in your report almost on every single page. Indeed, you report that some workers were told by their managers not to reveal the ethnicity of the perpetrators. What part do you really think ethnicity changed? Was it just political correctness, hiding what was going on?
That's a possibility. It's certainly the case that and I was glad to see that it did not affect how professional social workers approached the work they carried out with individual children. However, there was a very strong response and perception, as you say, that ethnic issues played some part in this. And the number of people I asked, why do you think this happened? The same question as you're asking me, why do you think this happened? Many have come up with that as a possible reason. When it comes, however, to the sexual exploitation of children,
Do you think it's the case that any sensitivity towards diversity, any ethnicity, any gender issues, surely that should just go out the window? Shouldn't the priority be taking children seriously?
Absolutely, and you'll see that I make that in one of my recommendations, where any ethnic dimension with any group is a critical factor, then it must be pursued and understood in order to bring perpetrators to justice.
Professor Jay, you've looked in detail at what was going on in this one town. We know already that it was happening in several others, but do you think we're anywhere near really getting a grip of the scale of this problem as a country overall?
I think the fact that we have no national system of reporting information and gathering data about the problem means that we can't compare one area with another. I certainly have no evidence to suggest that Rotherham is very much worse than other places. So it's impossible to tell, and nobody could tell you what the true scale of child sexual exploitation in Britain is, but it's almost certainly underestimated significantly.
And ought we to have such a national system?
It would certainly help to understand the true scale of the problem if there were some kind of system for gathering information at a national level.
Professor Jay, thank you very much indeed. Well, Tim Loughton was Children's Minister from 2010 to 2012, and he's in Brighton. And Sarah Champion is the Rotherham MP and the author of a recent parliamentary report on child sexual exploitation. She's in Sheffield, also with us tonight. Sarah Champion, you worked in Rotherham for many years before becoming an MP. Did you have any understanding of the scale of what was going on before today?
No, and to be quite honest, until I saw the report, I knew that there had been instances of it before, but 1,400 children and young people being abused in that way, and that's 1,400 that have actually had the courage to come forward. They weren't acknowledged and they weren't supported, but they came forward. So what terrifies me is the number of children that have been through this experience and haven't had the courage to come forward, and we have to do something very dramatic to make those children know that now we will listen to them, because what's very clear is in the past they weren't listened to, they weren't respected, and they weren't taken seriously.
Tim Loughton, when you were Children's Minister, you worked very closely on this issue.
Yeah.
Were you aware that police and council members and managers were ignoring warnings of this kind of problem?
Yes, and that was part of the problem that back in 2011 I launched the Child Sexual Exploitation Action Plan, which was a major piece of work. It brought together police, children's services, academics, children's charities and lots of experts to say we've got to get a grip on this. And that happened because of the Operation Retriever and the Derby case, with the appalling cases of those children systematically abused by, again, Pakistani gangs. And it really brought all this out into the daylight. And because those people were pursued and were prosecuted, more people then came forward and people started to take this seriously, starting with the police and with children's services. And I think that has changed everything. It's still going on, it's still a major problem, but I think we've realised it's a problem and much more is now being done about it. But in Rotherham, it's a very serious problem it's been.
Given that framework that you put in place, though, you must be alarmed to hear from Professor Jay that in her view this kind of thing is not just still going on, but troubled children are still being sometimes turned away. Even the very victims identified in this report aren't getting the help they need. I mean, has the government lost sight of the problem since you departed?
No, I hope the government hasn't lost sight of the problem, and lots of good practical things are happening, but it required a change in mindset. I mean, clearly what's come out in the Rotherham case, and it's not unique to Rotherham, is that the police, in the interest, it seems, of political correctness, were turning a blind eye, shuffling under the carpet the activities of serious abusers, rapists, criminals and torturers. That is a disgrace. That cannot be allowed to happen anymore, and police have been trained and really brought around the table to work with other agencies to make sure that they are clamping down on this sort of thing. And there isn't any excuse for this. Whatever the ethnic background of the people perpetrating this, they are criminals and it must be stopped. They must be brought to justice. And a lot of them are now being brought to justice, and a lot of them are now in jail. Not enough. More has to be done to bring more of them to justice.
There is, though, the role here, Sarah Champion, of the authorities looking the other way. Now, your constituents know tonight that nobody working in your town who is implicated in this report is still in child protection services in your town. But they may well be working elsewhere. And indeed, we know from Professor Jay that the Chief Executive of the Council has written to their current employers, essentially to warn them, should people implicated here still be working in child protection?
I have very grave concerns about that. I mean, clearly what's happened is, whilst the frontline staff were very aware of the problems and were really trying to make the voices of those young people heard, the more senior managers were, I don't know if they were turning a blind eye to it. I don't know what their justification could possibly be for this, because I don't think that there is any. But the fact that they could still be working in child protection, of course, that is something that well, I think all of us are very concerned about that, and it's something that we need to investigate really fast. I know that the Chief Executive has written to all of their employers, but it's the fact that that sort of benign neglect of the children that they're meant to be taking care of can still be going on that I think will concern everyone.
And indeed, Tim Lawton, not a single person has either been sacked or disciplined. If you were still Children's Minister tonight, would you be content with that? And would you be content with people still working elsewhere in child protection?
I certainly wouldn't, and I'm afraid it's too common a theme that when these scandals take place, be it in Haringey, in Rochdale or whatever, that actually nobody or very few people actually pay the consequences and are sacked. And frankly, in the case of Rotherham, a social worker responsible for protecting vulnerable children to turn a blind eye to a 12-year-old having sexual relationships with a stranger twice, 3 times her age, and to say, well, that was consensual sex, and to do nothing about it, that person has absolutely no place in anything to do with vulnerable children. And if they are still practising anywhere, they shouldn't be. And frankly, we do need to look at the records of some of the people who were in positions of responsibility when this sort of abuse was going on in Rotherham and in other places. And it's not good enough just to say, oh, well, I wasn't there when all this was happening. At least the leader of the council, and I'm not saying he's directly responsible, but this stuff was happening when he was at the helm, has done the decent thing and stood down. But there are many practitioners whose day-to-day jobs are supposed to be looking after vulnerable children who have clearly failed, and failed too many children very badly.
We must leave it there, but Tim Lawton and Sarah Champion, thank you both very much indeed for being with us tonight. Now, explosions on the streets in Gaza tonight marked not more violence, but a ceasefire between Israel and the Palestinians after weeks of fighting and more than 2,000 deaths. The deal, brokered by Egypt, swaps an end to hostilities for an easing of border restrictions on Gaza. But previous ceasefires have not lasted. Will this one be any different? The BBC's Quentin Somerville is there tonight.
Certainly on the streets of Gaza tonight, people seem to think it will be, because they came out in their many thousands. They were celebrating not just the ceasefire, but what they were calling victory over Israel. And in the previous deals, we haven't seen that. Some of those ceasefires lasted a couple of hours, some of them lasted as long as 5 days. Certainly the feeling here seems to be that this one may well be different. And perhaps one of the reasons they feel it's different is because the blockade is being lifted, or at least partially lifted, the blockade that both Egypt and Israel enforce around here in Gaza. But when you look at the details of this deal, it doesn't look very dissimilar from the ceasefire agreement that was agreed after the 2012 war with Gaza. So it's difficult to see really what has been achieved. And when you ask Israelis what has been achieved, they will say that they have removed a number of key Hamas leaders, that they've put pressure on Hamas, that they've destroyed a network of Hamas tunnels that were making their way into Israel in a way that Israel never really realised before. Some would blame a failure of intelligence for that. As for Hamas, what have Hamas achieved? Well, 2,000 people plus have died here, most of them civilians, many women and children, but Hamas has gained a relevance again. People are suddenly talking about Gaza and their cause in a way that they weren't. Certainly internationally they are. And among Palestinians, a group that was perhaps by some seeing as being increasingly irrelevant after moving into a deal with the Palestinian Authority for a unity government. Hamas, which is a body which supports an armed struggle, has shown it can still take the fight to Israel, and it can still be left standing at the end of that fight.
Well, the handshakes could hardly have been more awkward when Vladimir Putin and Petro Poroshenko met to try to sort out the mess in Ukraine today, as Russian supporters try to redraw the map. Russia flexing its considerable muscles is more than just a little local difficulty. But if the rest of Europe really wanted to intervene, if Russia pushes further, would we be strong enough to do so? One of the most senior military men in the continent, General Sir Richard Sheriff, former Deputy Supreme Commander at NATO, thinks not. Our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban, has been talking to him.
Ukraine has put on show detainees who are members of a Russian paratroop regiment. Moscow admits they crossed the border, but says it was an accident. It's one more sign of a desire to intimidate Ukraine, says the general, who until recently was NATO's #2, and who, as the crisis in Eastern Europe unfolded, saw gaps between alliance rhetoric and taking concrete steps.
The issue with NATO is always how NATO generates the forces required to conduct the operations its politicians sign up to. And there is a regular mismatch between the rhetoric that we hear around the North Atlantic Council table about commitment to operations and what nations are really prepared to put on the table. As far as the potential crisis, or the crisis in Eastern Europe and Eastern Ukraine, I think the reality is that NATO would be very hard-pressed, and they would find it very difficult to put into the field, at sea or into the air, the means required to, particularly on land, I would assess, to counter any form of Russian adventurism.
Does that mean then that Western Europe is essentially defenceless against Russia?
It means that, well, now you're getting into the whole question about NATO, about Europe and America. Certainly, Western Europe would not be able to defend against, in my view, against Russia without significant support from the Americans. I think NATO would find it really difficult to get a division out of the door in quick time.
That's 20,000?
20,000 people out of the door in quick time. Because effectively, and certainly in Western Europe, what we have seen progressively is a dismantling of military capability.
Do you appreciate that effectively saying NATO needs to rearm, which is what I think you are saying, is a very unpopular message in this time of economic stringency?
I've no doubt it's an unpopular message, but it's a message that our political leadership need to take home and listen to and act on if they're serious about ensuring that NATO has the means to defend itself in future. If you look across the NATO alliance, only 4 nations out of 28 spend more than the minimum of 2% on GDP that all 28 nations have signed up to around the North Atlantic Council table. So you've got significant economic powerhouses within the alliance who spend well below the 2% of GDP on defence. And if NATO is serious about this, it is going to have to rearm. It is going to have to rebuild capability. European nations are going to have to put their money in their pocket, put their hands in their pockets to spend more money on defence.
But Libya, where NATO helped topple Colonel Gaddafi, shows the risks of taking action. In recent days, Tripoli airport has been largely destroyed by rival militias as civil war grips the country. NATO intervened to protect the people of Benghazi from their former leader. So what responsibility does it bear for the subsequent mess?
NATO was tasked by the United Nations to protect, and NATO did the job very effectively. And of course, when that campaign came to an end, or that air campaign came to an end with the murder of Gaddafi and the collapse of the Gaddafi regime, NATO was stood by, had done the contingency planning necessary to go in and support the whatever Libyan government emerged from that chaos if it was required. The message very clearly was no requirement, no desire for any form of foreign intervention, so NATO stands back. And The resulting chaos is plain and evident for all to see. But this is just one of the realities, I think, of the strategic context that we see at the moment.
And the desire to protect vulnerable minorities in northern Iraq now plays its part in a new intervention. The jihadists of ISIS, now calling themselves the Islamic State, have beheaded and massacred Iraqis and Syrians alike. So how far should the UK follow America's lead, and what should the objective be?
I think the first priority is to protect, but ultimately the priority must be to eradicate Islamic State as an external threat because of the potential impact on the Middle East, on our friends in the Middle East, but also its potential impact if this sort of incubus is allowed to survive, the potential impact on our security, on our external security, whether it's through the import of terrorists or whatever, but also there is a very clear issue as far as internal security is concerned, given the number of British and other Western-born
UK internal.
Yeah. Well, I think it's not purely a British problem. I mean, it's a problem that applies right across Western Europe.
Does that mean inexorably that US, UK end up fighting Islamic State in Syria, being effectively on the same side as Assad?
All I would say is that there can be no eradication of Islamic State as a threat without a regional approach. Islamic State is operating and has spread into Syria, and therefore there is likely to be, or inevitably going to be, a need to sit down and talk to difficult bedfellows, bad people.
The Prime Minister's been very direct in saying that the Islamic State has to be countered, has to be reversed, and ultimately defeated. How achievable is that?
It's one thing to say that we're going to deal with it, but you have to back up your words with actions. And in my view, we should therefore rule out nothing. And going back to what the Prime Minister has said, ruling out combat boots or boots on the ground, and saying, as he did in the paper the other day, we don't want to fight, is immediately giving your opposition 15 or 30 points up at the beginning of the match. So I think we must apply all the levers of power, political, diplomatic, economic, and of course military. But above all, we need to establish the international political will to deal with this. And of course, in the NATO summit coming up, we have there is a real opportunity.
General Shirreff. Now, just in case you were thinking or indeed hoping that you had a few more days peace and quiet from MPs before the poor dears have to come back from holidays, today was a big day for two wannabes you've probably heard of. Boris Johnson gave away the worst kept secret in politics. He wants to stand as an MP in the West London constituency of Uxbridge and West Ruislip. And the other UK politician, recognisable by only his first name, well, he went a step further. Nigel Farage, the UKIP leader, was chosen as his party's candidate for Thanet South in Kent. Jim Reid went along to witness his celebrations.
Mr. Nigel Farage.
This was always going to be more of an inauguration than a selection process. The press were invited to film the hustings here in South Thanet, a good sign the result was never in doubt. The race here is now shaping up to be the most interesting battle of the next general election. South Thanet is prime UKIP territory.
I was a poor handicap golfer, and there were lots of golf courses here. And another one of my hobbies, there's quite a lot of pubs, I've noticed.
When it's clear, you can see France from the beach here in Ramsgate. Not today in this weather. It might just be 30 miles away, but Europe and immigration are worries here, as are wider concerns about jobs and the economy. At the Rising Sun Cafe works Miriam Renahim, a UKIP voter in the past and the kind of supporter Nigel Farage will be banking on come May. Looking at UKIP's policies, what attracts you to that party?
Well, it's sorting out immigration and all of that initially, because I think it's gone way out of hand. I think somebody needs to rein it in and do something about it. And I like Nigel Farage. I think he's an okay bloke. He doesn't deserve to have eggs thrown at him.
Over the last 30 years, South Thanet has blown with the political wind. Labour in '97, back to Conservative in 2010. But reporters at the local paper say the shift to UKIP feels more than a protest vote. A poll last month put the party ahead in this seat for the first time after big gains in local elections last year.
The county council, where they just swept in, they took 7 seats out of the 8, was a bit of a shock, especially for the Conservatives who lost their seats. But since then they just seem to really be going from strength to strength.
The orthodox view is that UKIP will take votes from the Tories, both in this seat and nationally, though as the local elections showed, Nigel Farage is more than capable of winning in Labour strongholds.
Europe is an issue and people are worried about the amount of money that seems to go to Europe, but I know locally we have benefited fantastically through European funding, particularly Objective 2, ERDF and other monies.
That's a hard argument to make.
It is indeed. I think it's difficult to remind people of how we benefit from connections with Europe.
So, Will, this is not good news for you, Mr Farage standing. This is going to make your job more difficult, you would have thought.
No, I think we're going to do the exact same thing we've been doing for the last 13 months. You knock on the doors, you speak to people, you talk about the issues. That's what I'm going to be doing for the next 9 months. It's what I've done all the time I've been involved in politics.
You're not going to get down the pub with your pint straight away then?
No.
Try to compete.
As for the Conservatives, well, they weren't so keen to talk to us today, saying all this is just a distraction from the work that they're doing. The new Tory candidate, Craig McKinley, is in fact a former leader of UKIP and a man who's made no secret of his own Eurosceptic views.
How you doing? All right? All right. Good, nice to meet you. Yeah. Could have picked a better day than this, couldn't you?
Mr Farage took to the High Street this afternoon ahead of his official selection. UKIP has done well in past European elections, only to see that support melt away in the general election that followed. Voter concern with immigration in particular may break that pattern. A survey today puts the party's national support at more than 16%.
The message he's sending out to the other parties is that they're not representing the normal people on the street, especially locally around here. I couldn't tell you what he thinks about with the hospitals and policing or anything else other than immigration, but he's got him to where he has, so fair enough.
I make him as a bit of a racist. He's all about the white British rather than British as a whole. I do agree with the fact that we need to limit how many people are coming into this country. We are a small island nation and we're getting overcrowded.
Somebody once said that I was David Cameron's worst nightmare.
After the European elections, Nigel Farage spoke of a political earthquake. He'll be hoping a result in South Thanet and other target seats will put UKIP in the heart of Westminster, changing the political landscape for good.
Well, keen constituency watchers may well have noticed that Boris Johnson, of course, will be standing in Uxbridge and South Ruislip, not West Ruislip. But a bit earlier, I spoke to the newly selected UKIP candidate for his hopeful seat in Kent, just after his selection was announced. Nigel Farage, congratulations on your selection. You said you want to run in Thanet South because of the appeal of sea angling, golf courses and the pub. But what's the appeal of you to Thanet South?
Well, you know, I made a couple of off-the-cuff remarks about why I like the place. The appeal of UKIP to Thanet South is that it's a very well-organised local party. You know, a lot of politics operates on a voluntary level. And we've got a very good volunteer group here. And that, I mean, you know, that meeting tonight, that room was packed with people, all ages, all backgrounds, with a real enthusiasm. But the key to this, and actually the key to my candidacy, is the fact that we have managed to establish here a base, a foothold in local government. Of the 8 Kent County Council seats that cover the island of Thanet, UKIP won 7 of them in 2013. We've won a district council by-election since then. The whole of Thanet District Council is up next year on the same day as the general election, and we'll be fighting all 56 seats. So it won't just be me fighting this campaign, it'll be our local candidates, our local councillors and our local enthusiasts. And I think that cocktail is something that the Lib Dems of the 1990s proved, that with enthusiasm and with optimism, it's surprising what you can achieve.
But if that base is successful in achieving to attract many thousands of votes in that area, isn't it the case that what you're going to do is hurt the Conservative vote, and they are the party promising a referendum just as you do, and you're actually going to make that referendum less likely if you succeed, aren't you?
Well, I think in Thanet, if you're Eurosceptic and you vote Conservative, I think the risk is you might let Labour in. So I don't think that people will want to vote for an imitation. I think people will want to vote for the real thing. We will be the challengers to the Labour Party. That's how I see this seat. I see it as a contest between us and the Labour Party primarily, and this old-fashioned, outdated idea that UKIP voters are all ex-Tories is frankly baloney.
But
we're picking up a large chunk of old Labour votes.
You know very well, though, Mr Farage, most of the voters who choose UKIP from time to time are former Conservative voters. And even in that seat there, the Conservative candidate was one of the founding members of UKIP. So, come on, you're not really going to suggest that you standing might not split the Eurosceptic vote.
OK, let's try this again. I think that view is total and utter rubbish. We pick up a majority of our votes in Thanet here from people who are not Conservative voters. We pick up not just a big chunk of the old Labour vote, we also pick up a lot of people who haven't engaged in the political process for 20 years, or in some cases, never at all in their lives. You know, we saw it in Eastleigh. If the Conservatives hadn't picked a very UKIP candidate and hadn't split the UKIP vote, we would have beaten the Liberal Democrats. Now, whilst I accept this is not the case in every single seat in Britain, there are seats like this where UKIP is the key challenger, and if we can get the Eurosceptics to muster around UKIP, we will win. Otherwise, there's actually more of a risk here in Thanet that Labour will win.
What happens if you don't win, and indeed if UKIP doesn't send any MPs to Westminster at the election? What will you do?
I've absolutely no idea. That's 8 months away. It's funny, all through my career people have said, well, what will you do if you fail? What will you do if you don't succeed? Well, the answer in life is to fight and stand up for what you believe in. We have really had an extraordinary year. We've won a national election in the European elections. Our opinion poll ratings are holding very, very steady. Specialist polling data from people like Lord Ashcroft now puts us ahead in some parliamentary constituencies, and I think we're going to succeed. I think we are going to get MPs elected to Westminster next year. I don't at this stage know how many, but if things go the right way for us, who knows? We could even hold the balance of power.
Nigel Farage, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, it's been a long time, a very long time, a very, very long time since she appeared on the stage. It's true, not all of you might think that's a shame, but for an ardent, passionate and considerable group, the relative exile of Kate Bush, 35 years long, has been tragic. Here's a reminder of what we've been missing from Stephen Smith.
These days, pop acts have comebacks before you've even noticed they've gone. But Kate Bush has been missed for every one of the 35 years since her last run of concerts. What took her so long? I'm waiting to meet the man who helped to dream up her last tour way back in 1979. I think this is him now.
Thanks for dropping in.
Now trading as Simon Drake's House of Magic, my host remembers life on the road with Kate Bush, including the time he was knocked out cold on stage.
I woke up feeling pretty strange, lying on the floor in Kate's arms. She was saying, please don't die, Simon, please don't die. Yeah, well, I could have actually died happily then, to be honest. It was such a big thing, that tour at the time. It was like sort of Beatlemania, you know. And there were 13 people on stage and God knows how many others, you know, travelling around England and Europe. I mean, I remember sitting in her kitchen over 10 years ago now, and I said it would be great if you just did 6 nights at the festival hall. She actually said to me, Simon, I don't think anyone really cares anymore. They don't really know who I am now. I went, for God's sake. You know, I mean, she's genuinely modest. This isn't somebody just faking it. She really genuinely is a quite humble person.
Even at the height of her success, there were signs that Kate Bush could be happy with a more domestic life, where she could work on her recipes.
It is what I would cook, yeah.
Let's have a look at this one first. And this is vegetables. What sort of vegetables are in here?
Well, we've got carrots, mushrooms, tomatoes, She did them just naturally. You can cook them in, you can even cook them in Marmite. That's like a good gravy substitute. And soy sauce is very good. All sorts of things.
But why has her public waited so patiently for her? We asked the man who made her debut video so memorable, her mime coach. Yes, for the first time on British TV, it's mime on Skype.
It was 1976, and it was at the Dance Centre in London's Covent Garden. I was teaching classes there, and she came to one of the classes, totally unknown, without real training, in my definition, but there was something about Kate, even then, as unformed as she was so many decades ago, there was a spark within her, and one could say that she was illumined by some kind of internal light.
And she'll be here for another 21 nights only.
Well, we've whisked two very special reviewers out of the gig early and into the studio to give us a flavour of what it was like. Gemma Arterton is here, as well as the musician Anna Calvi. Gemma, firstly to you, what was it like? Was it what you expected?
No, I think everybody was so excited just to see her. When we arrived, you know, the expectation from the audience was immense, and there was just so much love coming from them and so much excitement. And then she kind of launched into a typical rock sort of gig, you know, which wasn't what we expected.
Yeah, it was kind of like, okay, this is cool, but, you know, you expected something more, and then suddenly the show went into the most crazy, kind of imaginative, creative world, which is what's so amazing about Kate Bush, and it felt like her brain, like you were inside her mind.
Yeah. Well, we've got some stills, some images actually of what it was like tonight that we can bring up now. You say a crazy, imaginative, creative world, like her brain. I mean, what was that? What are we looking at on stage?
So she did, in the first half, she did sort of like a performance theatre-based, it felt like musical theatre or opera, based to her Ninth Wave, second half of her Hounds of Love album. So it's all about, you know, a shipwreck and being stranded at sea.
And for the non-specialist, Gemma, what year was that album out?
Oh gosh, actually, don't ask me that. I feel like it's the year I was born or something, or even maybe before I was born.
But sometime then, a long, long time ago. So she didn't commit that sin that musicians sometimes do, of coming on, playing all the new tunes to the fans and not giving them any old hits.
No, I mean, there was a combination. She did Hounds of Love, she did Running Up That Hill, which was a highlight, I think. Like, the whole audience just stood up, and there was such an energy. And she did stuff from Ariel, which was released in 2005.
Yeah, I think she did a whole section on Ariel. It was just stunning.
But one of the interesting things about this, though, I mean, both of you, if I'm correct, and correct me if I'm wrong, weren't born the last time she performed on stage. Now, she was an exceptional artist at the time, but why do you think it is she's translated to a whole new generation? I mean, how did you become a fan in the first place?
I think a friend introduced me to her music, and as a singer, I was struck at how she can really channel so many different characters, but they all feel very uniquely her. It's like she uses these characters as tools to create something incredibly personal, and I think that's a very rare thing for someone to be able to do that.
Gemma, what about for you?
Yeah, I think I was just, it was my mum and my sister, well, it's my mum that got me onto her, and again it was her storytelling and also her innate absolute expression of femininity that was so, at the time, and it wasn't a sexualised thing. It was just...
She felt like your big sister. Or
yeah, yeah, and just really loving, and a lot of her music. I mean, some of it is quite scary, and I remember as a kid I was always quite scared by her stuff. But it's sort of unapologetically feminine, and is really the most original female singer, I think, even now. I mean, it has inspired so many other brilliant musicians, but she was kind of the first one.
But some people, though, would look at that and say what you describe as being original is, in the nicest possible way, a bit bonkers.
Yeah.
But it is. I think she's celebrating the absurdity of life, and she's showing the beauty in it. And the things that she talks about are incredibly simple, about watching the sun rise, you know, about taking out the washing, but she shows you how beautiful they are. And this is the kind of the best thing about art, when it does this, when it transforms you and makes you see the simple things in a profound way.
What's a very simple question, though, all these years on, if you think back to those extraordinary vocal performances, I suppose, something like Wuthering Heights, tonight, how was her voice? Can she still deliver those performances in the way that she did?
Yes,
absolutely.
And as the show went on, it got better and better. Yeah. You could feel at the beginning that she was a bit nervous, and everyone was rooting for her, you know. And then as the gig went on, she just completely just soared. She just took off.
You made this sound like some kind of ultimate magical family reunion.
One of the best shows I've ever been to.
Yeah,
it really was. Just everything about it, you know, was just the energy and.
Even if I wasn't a big Kate Bush fan and I went along to it, I think it was just everything about it was so high. The quality of everything was so high and well thought out, and you don't see that with gig type stuff. You know, it was like a whole show. And
the detail was very unique.
And her son, her son.
So it was a family affair then. Yeah. What happened with her son?
Her son was in the whole thing. He was there as a backing dancer, then he was there as part of the
He was like an MC even, wasn't he? He sort of guided it, especially the aerial part. He was the painter in the whole in his section, and he does a whole musical number.
So she was keeping it in the family.
It's very touching.
Yeah, really touching.
Because she's so, you know, pushes the world away, and then for her to open up her life to an audience.
Very briefly, one of the things she did try to push away was people using their phones, whatever they had, their gadgets in their pocket to record or snap pictures of her. Just briefly, did people stick to that rule?
Yeah.
They did?
Yeah. I think everyone that was there was so appreciative of how special that night was, this night was, especially the opening night. And it just felt like everybody just wanted to be present. And yeah, it was amazing, yeah.
Thank you both so much. I feel I ought to apologise for dragging you away early, but we're very glad that you did. Now, a very quick look at the papers, and there she is on the front of all of them, pretty much. Kate Bush there on the front of The Guardian, a small picture of her on The Sun, and of course our main story about child abuse victims and that shocking report. Similarly, The Times and also the Daily Telegraph, both with that story, and also 2 more pictures of Kate Bush in all her glory. That is all we have time for, I'm afraid, tonight. Good night.
Hello, it looks like the weather will be settling down for a time next week, warming up a bit too. Between now and then, though, there's a bit more rain to come. Not during Wednesday. Most places will have a dry day with some sunny spells, but there will be some outbreaks of rain heading eventually into southwest England and South Wales. Cloud increasing in Northern Ireland, but a fine day to come here. Another lovely day in Scotland, where you have the sunshine. It'll feel pleasantly warm. Chilly start, mind you, maybe 1 or 2 early fog patches. All of that will clear, and it will be another lovely day. Fine day too into Northern England. The breeze beginning to freshen, as it will be across the rest of the UK, but a much better picture for southeast England, across the Midlands too. Temperatures higher, so feeling warmer. But I think more importantly, it's going to be drier and brighter than it has been recently. Now, the rain coming into southwest England will initially be patchy in nature. It will turn more persistent, though, going into the evening. But you can see the strength of the wind here as it picks up, and into South Wales too. A few spits and spots later in the day, but certainly turning wetter as we go through the evening. But most places then for Wednesday having a fine day. Now, that rain on Thursday will be moving north across Scotland, clearing away from eastern England. Bright and breezy conditions elsewhere with a scattering of showers. showers, but actually many places may well avoid them and stay dry. High teens and low 20s for your temperature on Thursday. So this is how it's shaping up. Wet start in Scotland, rain eventually clearing, the rain clearing more quickly from eastern England. You can see a few showers following on behind. Showers more widespread on Friday though, a windier day too, but improving weather at the weekend.
Can our much-needed umbrellas be improved? Someone's going to try in Dragon's Den next. With just over 3 weeks to go to the referendum on Scottish independence, if you miss the Salmond versus Darling debate, catch up with Scotland Decides. Available now on BBC iPlayer.
Hitler is creating a force that will vastly outnumber ours.
I have an idea for a whistling device.
If they don't have proof it works, they will pull the plug.
People are depending upon us, not just ministry people, our loved ones.
We're flogging our guts out here on someone that'll probably never work anywhere. You are not allowed to give up.
This man appears to be living in cloud cuckoo land.
We saw you!
How the men who invented radar helped us win the Battle of Britain. Eddie is our stars in Castles in the Sky, Thursday the 4th of September on BBC Two.
You're gonna have to choose between music and family.
If I choose family, does it have to be this family?
The Griffins are back.
It's a cause for celebration.
And they're the bestest damn family in the whole world.
Mi amore.
I've been kind of using Rupert as a chew toy.
Chewing him with your crotch?
Well, they're all right.
I don't like what success is doing to you.
Here's the key to my hotel room. You can flush the dump I left in there.
Brand new Family Guy, Sunday at 10 on BBC Three and BBC Three HD.